Welcome to Simplified UPSC by PPP, where we listen, learn, and grow together. Detailed lecture notes in English and Hindi, plus practice questions for prelims and mains, only on our Telegram channel. Link in description. Like and subscribe for more.
Welcome back to the deep dive. You've brought us a pretty comprehensive stack of source material today.
Yes, indeed.
All focused on, well, the real bedrock of environmental studies, biodiversity.
That's the one.
And this isn't just, a quick tour of nature. We're talking about really mastering the essentials here, the concepts, the facts.
Definitions, threats, the policies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Everything you need to understand conservation, not just globally, but how it plays out in policy too.
That's absolutely right. Our mission today really is detail. We're not summarizing.
No cutting corners.
None. We need to build a really robust foundation. So that means pulling out and explaining every key definition, the specific numbers behind threat levels, the whole toolbox of conservation methods.
Right.
The idea is to turn that textbook knowledge into something functional, something you can actually use when thinking about policy.
Okay. Sounds like a plan. So our journey today, we'll start by defining what biodiversity actually is across those different scales.
The three critical levels, yes.
Yeah. Then we'll look at how it's measured and, crucially, why it's so valuable, the utilitarian side of things.
The ecosystem services, yeah.
From there, we have to go to the tough stuff,
Uh-huh.
the Evil Quartet, the big drivers of loss.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, wrap up with a good look at the conservation strategies, both global and local. Okay, let's dive in. Let's unpack the definition first.
Yeah.
What exactly is biological variety?
Well, biodiversity at its simplest, it just means the variability among living things, all sources, land, sea, rivers, you name it.
Terrestrial, marine, aquatic ecosystem.
Exactly. But, for a really functional understanding, the source material breaks it down. It says this complexity exists at three fundamental levels, interlinked levels.
Okay.
And variation at each of these levels is absolutely vital for ecosystem health, for stability.
So it's much more than just a big list of species, isn't it? You have to look, well, deeper.
Yeah.
Inside the organisms.
Precisely. The most foundational level, that's genetic diversity. This is all about the variation in genes within a particular species. Think of it like the species' internal library of traits.
Right.
And this deep internal variation, it's functionally critical. It's the raw material that lets a species adapt.
Adapt to what exactly?
To changing environments, maybe resist new diseases or survive new predators that show up.
Ah, okay. So high genetic diversity is like the species' insurance policy against change, against uncertainty.
That's a perfect way to put it, an insurance policy.
So if, say, a nasty new disease appears
Yeah.
and only one specific gene version offers resistance, the species with more genetic diversity has a much better shot at having some individuals survive.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
Without that genetic robustness, a sudden shock, a disease, a big climate shift, it could potentially wipe out the entire species just because no individuals happen to have the right traits to survive that particular stress.
Right.
And that's why, conservation efforts often focus on preserving diverse gene pools. It's not just about counting heads, it's about the variety within those populations.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense. So moving up one level from the genes within, what's species diversity?
Right, species diversity. This is about the variety in the number and types of species you find in a specific area, a region.
Number and variety.
Yeah, and we usually quantify this in two main ways. First, there's species richness. That's simply the count of different species present.
Just how many types there are.
Exactly. And second, there's species evenness. This looks at how equally distributed the populations of those different species are.
Ah, okay. So you could have lots of species,
Yeah.
high richness, but if one or two just completely dominate the landscape, the evenness would be low.
Precisely. A healthy ecosystem often has both high richness and relatively high evenness.
Got it. And the third level, it seems like the big picture view, encompassing whole environments.
Correct. Level 3 is ecosystem or community diversity. This refers to the different types of habitats we find across the globe.
Habitats. How are they defined here?
The source material defines a habitat as the cumulative result of climate, vegetation, and geography in a region. So ecosystem diversity is about the variety of these complex interacting systems.
The different structures, the different functions?
Exactly. Think about the huge difference between, say, a desert ecosystem and a tropical rainforest.
Completely different worlds.
Or the functional difference between a coral reef, super productive, great at recycling nutrients, and a mangrove forest, which is amazing at stabilizing coastlines.
Can you give a few more examples from the sources, just to paint the picture?
Sure. The sources specifically mention things like corals, grasslands, wetlands, deserts, mangroves, and tropical rainforests. The sheer variety of these kinds of distinct life support systems is what we mean by ecosystem diversity.
Okay, so we've got the genetic building blocks inside species, then the variety of species themselves, and finally the large-scale environments they create and live in.
That's the hierarchy.
And protecting biodiversity means protecting that whole interconnected system, not just one piece.
Absolutely. You can't really separate them. Right, so we've defined it conceptually. Now, how do we actually measure it? We're moving into quantification, into ecological measurement.
Okay.
Now, genetic diversity and ecosystem diversity, those are often measured using pretty complex models. But for species diversity, there are three sort of established concepts used for comparison.
Alpha, beta, and gamma diversity. I remember seeing those.
That's them. They're foundational if you want to compare the diversity of different areas.
Okay, let's lay these out clearly. What's alpha diversity?
Alpha diversity is basically the diversity within a specific area or community. Think local. You measure it by counting the number of species in one particular spot, like a single patch of forest or a single pond.
Just the local count. Got it.
Then you have beta diversity. This measures the difference or the turnover in species between different habitats or maybe along an environmental gradient, like going up a mountain.
So it compares two places.
Exactly. It tells you how much the species composition changes as you move from one site to another. If beta diversity is high, it means the two sites you're comparing don't share many species. They're quite distinct.
Okay, alpha is local. Beta is the difference between local areas. So what does gamma cover?
Gamma diversity is the big picture. It's the total overall diversity for a large geographic region or landscape. It basically combines all the local alpha diversities within that region and accounts for the beta diversity between them.
The regional total.
Right. These three indices help ecologists figure out where diversity is concentrated and how connected or disconnected different ecosystems might be.
That framework is really useful for understanding structure. But what about the practical metrics? The ones used more directly in, say, conservation policy to decide where to focus efforts.
Ah, yes. A key metric there, and it's highlighted in the source material, is species endemism.
Endemism, meaning found only in one place.
Exactly. It's the concentration of species that are found only in a specific, often quite confined geographical area and nowhere else in the world.
And why is that so important for conservation?
Well, think about it. If a species' entire global population lives in one small area, the health of that one location becomes incredibly critical.
Right. If that habitat goes, the species goes.
Right.
Globally.
Precisely. So high levels of endemism instantly raise the conservation stakes.
Yeah.
Those areas become prime targets for protection efforts, like the biodiversity hotspots we'll talk about later.
Okay. Now, I wanted to bring up something that sometimes causes confusion in sources about measurement, this idea of a generalized diversity index. Sometimes it's described as a ratio, one species population over the total number of organisms across all species, and it's implied that a value of 1 means only one species exists, suggesting higher diversity gives a lower value.
That seems backward compared to standard indices like Shannon or Simpson.
Ah, yes, that's a really crucial point to clarify.
Yeah.
You're right. Standard ecological indices, the ones that are used widely like Shannon or Simpson, are designed so that a higher index value indicates higher diversity, more species, and more even distribution.
Now, if a source specifically frames a ratio where 1 means monoculture, 0 variety, it's likely trying to emphasize a theoretical endpoint, perhaps focusing purely on evenness hitting 0. But the principle we need to grasp is that these indices are tools.
Numerical tools.
Yes, tools to capture not just the count of species, richness, but also how evenly their populations are distributed, evenness. The takeaway is that a healthy, diverse ecosystem generally scores high on standard diversity indices because resources in abundance are spread across many different species. We should focus on that standard interpretation unless a source very explicitly defines an inverse scale.
That clarification helps a lot. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about what biodiversity is and how we measure it. Now let's shift to the why. Why should we care? Why should governments, pour resources into protecting it?
This is critical.
It links directly to those utilitarian arguments, doesn't it? Things vital for the economy, for security, for society's well-being. The essential services biodiversity provides.
Absolutely. The value goes way beyond just, liking animals or plants. Biodiversity directly underpins essential ecosystem services. The sources group these services quite neatly.
Okay, what's the first category?
Well, the most obvious are the direct ecosystem services.
Yeah.
These are often the non-consumptive benefits we get from healthy ecosystems working properly. Think about hydrological and climate regulation.
How does that work?
Forests are a prime example. They recycle moisture back into the atmosphere, they filter air, they prevent rapid water runoff from slopes, which reduces erosion and flooding downstream.
Right.
And coastal ecosystems, particularly mangroves, they're incredible. They act as huge natural buffers, moderating those damaging monsoonal tidal floods and reducing how far inland storm surges reach. They're like living seawalls.
So protecting a mangrove forest isn't just about saving trees or crabs.
No.
It's basically a massive, free investment in coastal defense infrastructure.
Absolutely. The protective functions are immense. Mangroves, seagrasses, coral reefs, they actively absorb wave energy, protecting coastal communities and lands from the devastating force of tsunamis, hurricanes, and major storms. It's a direct safety benefit.
Okay, what about the more material benefits, the things we actually harvest or use?
Right. Those generally fall under biological services. This is the provision of, well, stuff. Food, fiber, fuel, timber, raw materials for medicines.
Concrete resources.
Exactly. Think about fisheries supported by healthy rivers and oceans, or the potential for discovering new medicines from plants or microbes. Coral reefs are a fantastic example here, too.
How so?
They manage to be incredibly productive, teeming with life, even though they often exist in nutrient-poor tropical waters. They do this through amazing nutrient recycling.
Wow.
This high productivity earns them that nickname, the tropical rainforests of the oceans. They support a huge percentage of global fisheries and are hotspots for finding compounds used in pharmaceuticals.
Wow. Okay, so ecosystem regulation, protection, biological resources, anything else?
Yes, there's the category of social services. This covers the less tangible but still vital benefits.
Right.
Aesthetics, recreation, spiritual value. Think about the revenue generated from ecotourism, people traveling to see wildlife or beautiful landscapes. There's also the potential for future scientific discoveries we can't even imagine yet.
And culture.
And huge cultural and spiritual significance. Many diverse ecosystems and specific species are deeply important to local communities, which we see very powerfully in concepts like sacred groves, where protection is rooted in belief. Biodiversity really underpins human society in countless ways, often ways we only notice when they start to disappear.
That's a sobering thought. It really highlights the stakes when we talk about threats. Okay, so we've established this enormous value, which unfortunately leads us straight to the grim reality, the things driving biodiversity loss. Conservationists use a pretty dramatic term for the four big human-caused drivers.
The Evil Quartet.
Exactly. It sounds dramatic, but it kind of fits, doesn't it? Because these aren't just isolated problems. They're systemic, and their effects ripple outwards, cascading across entire ecosystems.
Understanding these four mechanisms and their specific impacts, which can be catastrophic, is absolutely fundamental. If you don't understand the cause, you can't design an effective policy or response.
Right. So let's break them down. Where do we start? What's the biggest culprit?
The prime cause, the one usually cited as having the largest impact globally, is habitat loss and fragmentation.
Loss and fragmentation. What's the difference?
Good question. Habitat loss is straightforward. It's the outright destruction or conversion of a natural habitat.
Yeah.
Think deforestation, draining wetlands, paving over grasslands. The habitat is just gone.
Okay. And fragmentation.
Fragmentation is more subtle but just as damaging. It's when a large, continuous block of habitat gets broken up into smaller, isolated patches.
How does that happen?
Usually through human activity slicing through it, building roads, dams, creating agricultural fields, urban sprawl. It chops the original habitat into disconnected islands.
Okay, so what are the main human activities driving the outright loss of habitat? The sources must give examples.
Oh, definitely. Deforestation is a huge one, driven by logging, mining operations, expansion of cities, and, critically, large-scale conversion to agriculture.
Agriculture? Like what?
The source gives specific examples. Clearing scrub jungle, which might look unproductive to some for dry land crops. This directly threatens species adapted to that specific habitat, like the great Indian bustard. Its home literally disappears.
Wow.
Underground mining is another driver mentioned. It requires huge amounts of timber to prop up the mine shafts and galleries, leading to more forest clearing.
And globally.
The most extreme example cited, one that gets a lot of attention, is the deforestation caused by establishing oil palm plantations, especially in places like Borneo and Sumatra.
Right. Huge areas cleared.
Yes, vast tracts of tropical rainforest are lost, and this has a devastating direct impact on endangered wildlife that lives there. The sources mention Sumatran tigers and orangutans specifically.
And the fragmentation part, why is breaking habitat into small pieces so bad it's still there, just chopped up?
Because those smaller pieces are fundamentally different. Fragmentation dramatically increases the edge effect.
Edge effect.
Yeah, the boundaries, the edges of a habitat fragment are much more exposed to external influences than the deep interior of a large forest. More light, more wind, higher temperatures, easier access for predators and invasive species.
So the quality of the remaining habitat degrades, especially near the edges.
Exactly. The viable core habitat, the undisturbed interior that many specialized species need, shrinks dramatically or disappears altogether. Plus, breaking up the habitat isolates populations.
Right. Animals can't move between patches easily.
Correct. Small, isolated populations become highly vulnerable to inbreeding, loss of genetic diversity, and local extinction events like a disease outbreak or a bad storm that wouldn't wipe out a larger connected population.
Okay, habitat loss and fragmentation, clearly the biggest driver. Let's move to the second member of the quartet. This one seems more about direct consumption.
That's right. Number 2 is overexploitation. This is essentially unsustainable use. Harvesting, hunting, fishing, collecting a species faster than its populations can naturally recover and reproduce.
Driven by demand, presumably.
Often by high market demand, yeah, sometimes coupled with ineffective regulation or illegal activity.
We hear a lot about poaching. Is that a key example here?
Absolutely. The sources point to the horrific economic pressures driving the poaching of the greater one-horned rhino. Its horn is incredibly valuable in traditional Asian medicine markets, especially, the source notes, in China.
Just for the horn.
Just for the horn. There's also illegal trapping of birds, often for the exotic pet trade, and the hunting of the Ch8, the Tibetan antelope.
Why the Ch8?
For its wool, Shatosh. It's incredibly fine and valuable, but the wool can only be obtained by killing the animal. So high demand directly translates to unsustainable hunting pressure.
It's not just famous mammals, though, is it? The sources mention other examples.
No, it affects all sorts of life. Overexploitation is a major problem in fisheries. The sources mention unsustainable harvesting in estuaries, where increased demand and highly efficient modern fishing gear can lead to the collapse of target fish stocks.
Fish stocks just can't keep up.
Exactly, and it even affects plants. The example given is cycads. These are ancient, slow-growing plants, almost like living fossils, but they're highly sought after for horticulture, for gardens, so they get over-harvested from the wild, pushing them towards extinction.
So the core issue is always taking more than can be replaced naturally.
That's the essence of overexploitation, human consumption rates exceeding biological recovery rates.
Okay, number 3 in the quartet. This one feels a bit different. It's about introducing outsiders.
Yes, alien invasive species invasions. This is when non-native species get introduced into a new environment, either deliberately or, more often, accidentally.
Through trade, maybe? Ballast water in ships?
Exactly. Global trade and travel are major pathways. The problem is, some of these introduced species become invasive. They spread aggressively, colonize new areas rapidly, and often outcompete or directly harm the native endemic species that evolved there.
Why are they often so successful?
Partly because they arrive without the natural predators, parasites, or diseases that kept their populations in check back in their native range. They have an unfair advantage in the new environment.
They run rampant. What are some specific examples, particularly problems highlighted in the source material for India?
The source lists several well-known aggressive colonizers that are major headaches.
Okay.
First, water hyacinth. Icornia crassipes, anyone who's seen it knows it. It's an aquatic plant that forms these dense mats on the surface of water bodies.
Chokes everything out.
Right, completely. Blocks sunlight, kills submerged native plants, uses up oxygen, harms fish populations. A massive nuisance for aquatic ecosystems.
What else?
Then there's Parthenium hysterophorus, often called Congress grass. You see it everywhere along roadsides, in wastelands.
That white-flowered weedy thing.
That's the one. It's not just an aggressive colonizer that pushes out native grasses and herbs. It also causes pretty severe allergies, skin rashes, respiratory problems in humans, and can be toxic to livestock.
Nasty stuff. Any others mentioned?
The source also mentions Datura, or thorn apple. While sometimes it's just an occasional weed popping up on disturbed ground, it can be an aggressive colonizer, quickly taking over open areas and disrupting the natural succession of native plants.
So these invaders fundamentally change the local ecology. They don't just add another species, they disrupt the whole system.
Precisely. They can alter nutrient cycles, fire regimes, hydrology. The impacts can be huge.
Okay, that brings us to the fourth and final member of the Evil Quartet. This one seems almost interconnectedly tragic. Co-extinctions.
Yes, co-extinctions. This is when the extinction of one species directly causes the extinction of another species that depends entirely on it.
A domino effect.
Exactly. It's a stark reminder that species don't exist in isolation. Life is this incredibly complex web of interactions. If you lose a host species, its specific parasites might disappear. If you lose a primary pollinator, the plant it pollinates might follow. Lose a specialized predator, and its specific prey might boom and crash, or its absence might cascade through the food web.
We need a really clear example to understand this dependency. Does the source provide one?
It provides a perfect, poignant example. It involves a critically endangered mammal and its dedicated parasite.
Okay.
The host is the pygmy hog, which is critically endangered, and the dependent species is the pygmy hog-sucking louse, Haematopinus oliveri.
A louse specific only to the pygmy hog.
Yes. This louse feeds only on the pygmy hog. It's completely specialized. So if the pygmy hog goes extinct, perhaps due to habitat loss or hunting, those other members of the Evil Quartet, then this louse.
It automatically disappears too, even if the louse itself wasn't directly targeted.
Exactly. Its fate is completely tied to its host. It will inevitably fall into the same extinction risk category simply because its only source of food, its only habitat is gone. That dependency is the core of co-extinction, a chilling illustration of interconnectedness.
Wow, okay. The Evil Quartet habitat loss and fragmentation, overexploitation, alien species invasions, and co-extinctions. A formidable set of threats. So facing these systemic threats, this Evil Quartet obviously requires organized responses, sophisticated policies, and generally these strategies seem to fall into two big categories, right? Two different philosophies almost.
That's a good way to put it. You have strategies focused on conserving life where it naturally exists, and strategies focused on protecting it elsewhere, often as a backup.
Let's start with the first one, the ideal approach, perhaps, the more holistic one.
Right. That would be in-situ conservation, literally meaning on-site.
On-site.
The formal definition provided is the conservation of ecosystems and natural habitats, and the maintenance and recovery of viable populations of species in their natural surroundings.
So protecting the whole environment, not just the species in isolation.
Exactly. The goal here is to protect the species and the natural evolutionary processes, the ecological interactions that sustain them within their own home.
What are the specific tools or mechanisms used for in-situ conservation, especially thinking about legal frameworks?
The primary tools are legally designated protected areas. The sources highlight national parks and wildlife sanctuaries.
We hear those terms a lot. How are they defined?
They're protected areas declared by state governments under India's Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. There's a crucial detail about schedules.
Ah, yes. The schedules in the Act determine the level of protection.
Precisely. Animals listed in Schedule 1 and Part 2 of Schedule 2. These are typically species facing the highest levels of threat receive absolute protection within these areas. Harming them carries the highest penalties.
Is there a difference between a national park and a wildlife sanctuary in terms of what's allowed?
Generally, yes. National parks typically aim for stricter protection, often allowing very little or no human activity inside. Wildlife sanctuaries might permit certain limited activities as long as they don't interfere with the primary goal of wildlife conservation, but both are state-managed protected areas under the Act.
Okay. Then there are these larger designations, often with international recognition, that try to blend conservation with human life. Biosphere reserves.
Exactly. Biosphere reserves. BRs. These are sites recognized under UNESCO's Man in the Biosphere, or MA program.
MB program.
Yes. And their whole philosophy is different. They aim to reconcile the conservation of biodiversity, both biological and cultural, with sustainable economic and social development. It's a much more complex balancing act.
Which requires a specific kind of zone structure, right?
Yes, they have a very characteristic structure with 3 interrelated zones, and the management rules change significantly across them.
Okay, let's detail those zones. This structure is key to understanding how BRs are supposed to work and where conflicts can arise.
All right. A Zone 1, the innermost area, is the core zone.
The heart of the reserve.
Right. This area is kept absolutely undisturbed, or as close to it as possible. It often contains prime habitat for endemic or highly endangered species. It has strict legal protection. Monitoring and research might be allowed, but human settlements and regular economic activities are generally prohibited.
A protected sanctum. Then around that.
Around the core, you have the buffer zone. This zone acts like a protective shield for the core. Activities are permitted here, but they need to be compatible with conservation objectives.
Like what?
Things like ecological restoration work, limited and sustainable tourism, environmental education, research, and training. The idea is to buffer the core from more intensive human impacts.
Okay, core, buffer, and the outermost layer.
That's the transition zone. This is where you see the most human activity. Sustainable development initiatives, human settlements, agriculture, managed forestry. These are expected here.
So this is where people live and work.
Yes, and crucially, management in the transition zone requires active collaboration with the local communities living there. It's about finding ways for people and nature to coexist sustainably.
And I imagine that's where a lot of the management challenges lie, balancing the needs of people in the transition zone with protecting the bufferland core.
Absolutely. That interface is often where policy friction occurs. Managing those different needs and expectations is complex.
Now, you mentioned the Wildlife Protection Act. Were there later amendments that brought in other types of reserves, maybe involving communities more directly?
Yes, the 2003 amendment introduced conservation reserves and community reserves.
What's the distinction there?
Conservation reserves are areas typically owned by the state government, often located adjacent to existing national parks or sanctuaries. The key thing is that they're managed through a specific committee, and importantly, this management happens in consultation with local communities. It builds in a participatory element.
And community reserves.
Community reserves are on private or community land where the community volunteers to dedicate the area for conservation. It empowers local communities to manage their own resources for wildlife protection.
We should also briefly mention reserved forests and protected forests, right? They also play a role.
Yes. Though their primary purpose might be timber production or watershed protection, they do contribute to in-situ conservation. Reserved forests generally have stricter rules where most rights are barred unless specifically granted. Protected forests are areas where rights like grazing or collecting minor forest produce might be allowed, but the government retains the power to restrict activities for conservation purposes. They offer varying degrees of protection.
Oh, okay. And finally, under in-situ, we absolutely have to talk about the grassroots model, the one often driven by belief rather than legislation.
Sacred groves, yes, these are fascinating and incredibly important.
What are they exactly?
They are essentially patches of forest, sometimes small, sometimes quite large, that are protected by local communities, not primarily because of government laws, but because they are dedicated to local folk deities or ancestral spirits.
Protection based on religious or cultural belief.
Exactly. Because of these deep-rooted beliefs, these groves are often fiercely protected by the community. They serve as vital refuges for biodiversity, often harboring rare or endemic species that have vanished from the surrounding, more disturbed landscape. They're like mini repositories of the original ecosystem.
Does the level of protection vary?
Yes, considerably. The source notes that in some sacred groves, the sanctity is so high that people are forbidden from removing even fallen dead leaves or dry twigs. In others, sustainable use of fallen parts might be allowed, but felling trees or hunting is strictly prohibited. But the underlying principle is community-based protection rooted in reverence.
It really shows the power of community commitment, doesn't it? Often more effective than top-down rules.
It can be incredibly effective and resilient.
Okay, so that covers the main in-situ approaches. But what happens if these aren't enough? If a species is on the brink, or its habitat is completely gone, or maybe just too fragmented to sustain a viable population?
That's when we have to turn to the second major category, ex-situ conservation, off-site conservation.
Off-site, taking them out of their natural home.
Yes. The formal definition is the conservation of components of biological diversity outside their natural habitats. It's often seen as a necessary backup plan, a safety net, or sometimes a last resort.
Why a last resort? What are the limitations?
We'll get into that, but first, what are the main methods or facilities used for ex-situ conservation?
Good point. What falls under this umbrella?
Well, the most traditional examples are botanical gardens for plants and zoos for animals.
Right. Places focused on display, but also conservation.
Increasingly, yes. Modern zoos and botanical gardens often have significant programs focused on captive breeding of endangered species, research, and public education. In India, zoos are regulated by the Central Zoo Authority, which sets standards for animal welfare and conservation contributions.
So they can be vital for saving species from immediate extinction.
They can be. But Ex-situ goes beyond just keeping live animals or plants. There's a whole suite of techniques for preserving genetic material.
Like seed banks.
Exactly. Seed banks are crucial. They store viable seeds from a huge variety of plant species, especially crop varieties and their wild relatives. This is vital for future food security and breeding programs.
And for animals or other genetic material?
We have gene banks. These facilities store genetic material more broadly, could be reproductive cells, tissues, DNA samples from both domesticated and wild species. This preserves the genetic blueprint.
And then there's freezing, right?
Yes, cryopreservation. This involves preserving biological material like sperm, eggs, embryos, or even tissue cultures at ultra-low temperatures, usually in liquid nitrogen.
Suspending animation, essentially.
Pretty much. It allows genetic material to be stored for very long periods, providing a vital resource for future breeding programs or even potential de-extinction efforts down the line, though that's still highly experimental.
Okay, so botanical gardens, zoos, seed banks, gene banks, cryopreservation, these are the main ex-situ tools. Now, back to the limitations. What are the main challenges or downsides of relying on ex-situ methods?
The biggest challenge fundamentally is maintaining genetic viability and evolutionary potential.
How so?
Well, captive populations, especially if founded from just a few individuals, are highly susceptible to genetic drift, random loss of gene variants, and inbreeding.
Losing that crucial genetic diversity we talked about earlier.
Precisely. You risk losing the very insurance policy the species needs to adapt in the long run. Managing captive populations to maintain maximum genetic diversity is a constant, complex, and expensive challenge.
And even if you succeed in breeding them, getting them back into the wild is hard.
Incredibly difficult. Animals raised in captivity often lack the essential survival skills, finding food, avoiding predators, social behaviors needed in the wild. And even if they survive, the limited genetic breadth might make the reintroduced population vulnerable. Ex-situ conservation essentially takes the species out of the evolutionary play happening in its natural environment.
So it's an isolated solution focused on the component, not the system.
Exactly. It's a vital tool in the box, especially for species on the absolute brink, but it doesn't replace the need to conserve the intact, functioning ecosystems where species actually evolved and belong. It's a safety net, not the whole solution.
All right, to make sense of all this threat and conservation effort globally, we need a common language. We need standardized ways to assess risk and prioritize action.
Which brings us to some key terminology and designations. Things you absolutely need to know for exams, but also just for understanding conservation news.
Top of the list has to be the IUCN Red List of threatened species.
IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. That's the one. The Red List is the global standard. It provides a scientifically rigorous framework using quantitative criteria to assess the extinction risk of thousands of species.
Quantitative criteria meaning based on actual numbers, like population size or rate of decline.
Exactly. It aims to be objective and globally applicable. It classifies species into different categories based on how close to extinction they are judged to be.
And this classification is hugely influential, right? It directs funding, policy attention.
Massively influential. Let's run through the main threat categories mentioned in the sources, starting with the most severe. Obviously, there's extinct, EX.
Gone forever.
Gone forever. No reasonable doubt the last individual has died. Then slightly less final, but still dire, is extinct in the wild, EW. Meaning the species only survives in captivity in zoos, botanical gardens, or maybe as a naturalized population somewhere outside its original native range, but it's gone from its natural home.
Okay. Then we get into the categories for species still hanging on in the wild, but in deep trouble.
Right. The highest risk category for wild populations is critically endangered, CE.
Critically endangered. What does that mean in terms of numbers?
It means the species is facing an extremely high risk of extinction in the wild in the immediate future. The criteria are very strict. For example, it could be based on a population reduction of 80% or more over the last 10 years or 3 generations.
80% reduction, wow.
Or an estimated population size of fewer than 50 mature individuals remaining. It's really down to the wire.
Do the sources give examples?
Yes, examples mentioned include the forest owlet and the hawksbill turtle, both facing that extremely high risk.
Okay, after critically endangered.
Next down is endangered at VN. Still facing a very high risk of extinction in the wild, just slightly less immediate than CE.
what are the criteria here?
Again, quantitative. It could be a population reduction of 70% or more over the last 10 years or 3 generations, or an estimated population size of fewer than 250 mature individuals. Still very precarious.
Examples for endangered.
The sources mention the chiru, that Tibetan antelope hunted for Ch8, and the green turtle.
Okay, CEEEN. What's next?
Vulnerable, VU. This category indicates a high risk of extinction in the wild in the medium-term future.
High risk. The numbers.
The criteria include things like a population reduction of 50% or more over 10 years or 3 generations. Still a serious decline, signaling significant risk.
Yeah, examples of vulnerable species.
The lion-tailed macaque and the greater one-horned rhino are mentioned here. Remember, the rhino is vulnerable overall, but heavily poached in some areas.
Right. It's crucial to remember these definitions rely on those specific numerical thresholds. It takes the guesswork out, makes it scientific.
It does. It allows for consistent assessment across different species and regions.
What about species that aren't facing such immediate threats? Are there lower categories?
Yes. Below vulnerable, you have near threatened, NT. These are species that don't quite meet the criteria for VU, EN, or CE now, but are close to qualifying or are likely to qualify in the near future if conservation actions aren't taken. The sandcat is given as an example.
Kind of on the watch list.
Exactly. Then there's least concern, LC. These species are evaluated but aren't considered at risk. They're typically widespread and abundant. Examples given are the caracal and the Tibetan fox.
And are there categories for species we just don't know enough about?
Yes, data deficient, DD, is used when there's inadequate information to make a direct or indirect assessment of its risk of extinction based on its distribution and/or population status. And finally, not evaluated, NE, for species that haven't yet been assessed against the criteria.
So the goal of conservation, ideally, is to move species down this list, away from critically endangered towards least concern.
That's the ultimate aim, yes, to reduce the extinction risk.
Okay, that's species-level risk assessment. Now, what about prioritizing areas? Identifying the places where conservation efforts will have the biggest impact. That brings us to hotspots, doesn't it?
Exactly. Biodiversity hotspots. This is a concept primarily developed by Norman Myers back in the late 80s.
And the idea is?
To identify regions of the world that are exceptionally rich in biodiversity, but are also under severe threat. Basically, areas with the most to lose and where intervention is most urgently needed.
High importance, high risk.
That's the core idea, and importantly, the definition relies on 2 very strict, quantifiable criteria that a region must meet to qualify as a hotspot.
Okay, these criteria are absolutely key. What's the first one?
The first criterion is species endemism. The region must contain a high percentage of plant life found nowhere else on Earth. Specifically, it must have at least 1,500 species of vascular plants as endemics.
1,500 endemic vascular plants.
Plants form the base of the ecosystem, and their diversity often correlates with the diversity of other groups like insects and vertebrates. That 1,500 number represents more than 0.5% of the world's total vascular plant species, concentrated in that region. It signifies unique, irreplaceable biological heritage.
Okay, so criterion 1. Must have exceptional endemism. What's criterion 2?
Criterion 2 is the degree of threat. The region must have already lost a significant portion of its original natural habitat. The threshold here is very high. It must have lost at least 70% of its original habitat extent.
70% loss. That's drastic.
It is. It means the region is already heavily impacted, and the remaining habitat, along with its endemic species, is under intense pressure from human activities.
So it's that combination, irreplaceable life and extreme habitat loss, that defines a hotspot and signals the need for urgent, focused conservation investment.
Precisely. It's a strategy for prioritizing conservation resources where they can potentially protect the most species per dollar spent, given the high threat levels.
Does the source give an example of a hotspot?
Yes, it mentions the Western Ghats in Sri Lanka region as a prominent example. It has incredible levels of endemism, but due to immense population pressure and development.
It's lost a lot of habitat.
Hugely. The source states that only about 6.8% of the original forest extent remains in relatively pristine condition, clearly meeting that over 70% losses criterion.
Wow. That really puts the threat level into perspective. Now, the sources also mention another, perhaps slightly less known, geographical designation. Hope spots. What are those?
Hope spots. This is a concept championed more recently, particularly by oceanographer Sylvia Earle in Mission Blue. It's focused specifically on the oceans.
Okay, so marine areas.
Yes. Hotspots are areas scientifically identified as being critical to the health of the ocean. They might be places with exceptional biodiversity, unique ecosystems, areas where vulnerable marine life congregates, or places with high potential for ecological recovery and restoration.
So it's less about catastrophic loss already having happened, like hotspots.
It can be partly about that, but it's often more proactive. It highlights areas of special ecological importance, including places that might still be relatively healthy, representing opportunities for protection before they become critically degraded. It's about identifying places that inspire hope for the future of the oceans if we act now. Less defined by strict quantitative thresholds, more about ecological significance and potential.
Interesting. A slightly different focus still about priority areas, but maybe with a more optimistic or forward-looking angle in some cases. Okay, this brings us nicely to a point where we can synthesize some of these ideas. We've talked about in-situ and ex-situ conservation strategies. They're clearly different tools serving different, sometimes overlapping purposes.
Definitely different philosophies and approaches.
So for you, the listener, thinking about how these apply in policy and practice, here's a key conceptual question to ponder. Why is in-situ conservation generally considered the more holistic and arguably the preferred or superior approach compared to ex-situ conservation? Recognizing, of course, that we often need both.
That's an excellent question to really get at the core difference. The fundamental advantage of in-situ conservation lies in its inherent holism.
Holism, meaning it looks at the whole picture.
Exactly. In-situ conservation aims to protect the entire ecosystem. It conserves not just the individual species, but also the natural habitat, the ongoing evolutionary processes happening within that environment, and critically, the complex web of interactions between species.
The biotic interaction.
Yes. Predator-prey dynamics, plant-pollinator relationships, host-parasite systems like the pygmy hog and its louse we discussed, nutrient cycling, competition, all the intricate connections that make an ecosystem function and allow species to adapt over time. In-situ manages for the system.
So it's like preserving the entire functioning factory, not just warehousing one of the products made by the factory.
That's a very good analogy. It keeps the evolutionary engine running within its natural context.
Okay, so if that's the strength of in-situ, what does ex-situ conservation fundamentally fail to conserve, even if it successfully keeps a species from going extinct in a zoo or seed bank?
The primary limitation of ex-situ is that it's inherently reductionist. It focuses mainly on protecting a single species, or sometimes just its genetic material outside of its natural dynamic habitat.
Taken out of context.
Precisely. Zoos, botanical gardens, gene banks, they are invaluable as safety nets, as we said. They can shield a population from immediate threats like habitat destruction or disease, but they hold the species in a relatively static, often artificial environment.
And that means?
It means they fundamentally fail to conserve those complex biotic interactions. The species isn't interacting with its natural predators, prey, competitors, or mutualists in the same way. It's also largely removed from the natural selection pressures that drive adaptation in the wild.
So evolution effectively stops, or at least dramatically slows down or changes direction in captivity.
Largely, yes. And as we discuss, maintaining the necessary genetic breadth for long-term adaptation becomes a huge artificial management challenge in small captive populations. It's incredibly difficult, often impossible, to replicate the richness and complexity of a natural ecosystem off-site.
So it's the difference between freezing a moment in time for a species versus allowing the whole ecological play, the whole evolutionary story to continue unfolding.
That captures it well.
The policy implication seems clear then. While ex-situ is an essential tool, especially for emergencies,
Absolutely essential.
the primary goal, the gold standard for long-term conservation, has to be effective in-situ protection, protecting species within their functioning, evolving natural homes.
That's generally the consensus in conservation science and policy. In-situ first, supported by ex-situ where necessary. #outro. Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive into biodiversity, let's quickly hit some key prelims pointers, those must-know facts and distinctions.
Fire away. What are the absolute takeaways?
First, be crystal clear on the difference between conservation strategies. In-situ is on-site. Think biosphere reserves, remember the core, buffer, transition zones, national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, and those community-protected sacred groves.
Got it. And ex-situ?
Ex-situ is off-site. Think zoos, botanical gardens, seed banks, gene banks, and cryopreservation techniques. Know which methods fall into which category.
Okay, what else?
the global designations. Know the two strict criteria for biodiversity hotspots. 1, high species endemism, at least 1,500 endemic vascular plants. And 2, high degree of threat, at least 70% original habitat loss. Those numbers matter.
Endemism and threat.
Right. And be familiar with the main IUCN red list categories and what they signify about risk level, especially critically endangered, CE, endangered EN, and vulnerable VU. And maybe recall an example for each, like the pygmy hog CE and its codependent louse.
Excellent prelims refresh. Now shifting to the bigger picture, the mains insights. What are the key conceptual takeaways for policy and analysis?
Well, thinking about challenges in Indian conservation, which links directly to GS Paper 3 themes, you have to grapple with the real-world complexities. Human-wildlife conflict is a major one. It's an almost inevitable consequence of habitat fragmentation and humans and large wildlife living in closer proximity. This is exactly why those carefully managed buffer and transition zones in biosphere reserves are so critical, though difficult to implement perfectly.
Trying to manage that interface.
Exactly. And then there's the constant pressure from development. Deforestation for mining, agriculture, infrastructure. These activities directly fuel the Evil Quartet, especially habitat loss. Balancing development needs with conservation imperatives is the perennial challenge.
Definitely a core tension in policy. But there are positive examples too, right? What about the role of people?
Absolutely. A key insight is the role of community participation. We saw this with sacred groves, but it applies more broadly. Community-led or co-managed conservation initiatives can be incredibly successful.
Why is that?
Because they often foster local ownership and stewardship. They can be more sustainable, culturally appropriate, and sometimes more effective in the long run than purely top-down, state-enforced protection, which can sometimes lead to resentment or conflict. Integrating local communities and traditional knowledge is increasingly seen as vital for successful, equitable conservation outcomes. It highlights that environmental management is deeply intertwined with social and cultural dimensions.
So blend the science with the societal context.
That's crucial for lasting success.
Okay, we've covered a huge amount. Definitions, value, threats, solutions, key terms. As a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. We've seen how interconnected life is, particularly with co-extinctions. So consider this. Think about the profound, almost unimaginable cascading effects of losing just a single keystone species.
Ah, the keystones.
Yeah, not just any species, but one whose impact on its environment is disproportionately large relative to its abundance. Often a top predator like a tiger or a lion, or maybe an ecosystem engineer like an elephant, or even a beaver.
Species that shape the entire structure.
Exactly. They might regulate populations of herbivores, which in turn affects vegetation structure. They might create habitats other species depend on. Losing that one keystone species, it wouldn't just be the loss of that animal. It could fundamentally destabilize the entire ecosystem.
Triggering trophic cascades, habitat changes.
Exactly. Potentially leading to waves of secondary extinctions, altering fire regimes, changing water flow. A complete system unraveling far beyond the initial loss. Protecting that one keystone species, therefore, isn't just about saving an icon. It's often about maintaining the integrity of the whole ecological edifice. It demands constant vigilance, understanding these deep connections, and building adaptability into our conservation policies, because the loss of one critical piece can bring the whole house down. Something to think about.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Telegram and Instagram. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.